let's jump right into this lecture. I hope you all had a great last week working on group projects and got a little break from lectures and readings, which I think is always nice. So I will be describing more updates in our walkthrough. There will be a change to the quizzes. I'll tell you why in that other video. So go check that out. And I hope that it's going to be a positive change and that it will benefit this class. So let's move on though to high incidence disabilities. Now, before we get into that, we have been on quite a journey, even in about 4 to 5 weeks. I've really enjoyed going through this with you all, and you all have shown that you're really mastering and gathering concepts throughout this class. I'm just going to reiterate them just to remind us where we've been and where we're going. So first thing, or one of the first things at least, we went over the history of special education. Your responses to that article were so incredible. I could just hear the advocacy in your voices and realizing that though things may look better now, and I think obviously we still have a ways to go, even prior to the 1960s, 70s, and before that time, things were tough, incredibly tough for students with disabilities. And to hear how passionate you were about that, and this is something you can carry into your classroom. You are going to be the advocates for the future, for your students, for your classroom, and you get the chance to make a difference in students' lives. I think this will be a fantastic opportunity. So we've got the reason why. Even general ed teachers will have many, many students with disabilities in your classroom for your whole career, and it's only increasing. So what you see now will probably become more in the future, and I'll have some stats about that here in a minute. We also talked about inclusion and the concept, in the past that we swung from complete segregation, even in other buildings, to the point where everybody's in the classroom. It doesn't matter if it's best for them or not. And we just want to, swing back to the middle and remember that as much as possible, we want all students to be included in the general ed classroom. Of course we do. But with that comes a responsibility, because we can't just throw students in a classroom and not provide highly effective teaching and strategies that are going to benefit our students. We don't want them sitting in the back table just working on a coloring sheet or just sitting and doing nothing, because we as teachers and a co-teacher didn't plan effectively. So we have to really watch out for that. And to keep in mind, if a student has a disability in a certain subject, let's say math, it might be better for them to be in a resource room for that one class so they can get intensive math help. So there's always shades to everything, and just wanted to note that inclusion is our ultimate goal, but we also have to make sure things are right for our students. We also looked at evidence-based practices. Now, once again, you all did an incredible job picking articles, finding the main points. You watched the help video, and I could tell you were really processing and pulling things correctly, which is fantastic. And that's one of the tools that you'll be able to use through your whole career. So even while you're at WKU, for example, let's say you're tutoring a student who has a math, maybe struggles in math, or maybe struggles in reading, whatever the topic. If you don't know what to do, you can even go look up articles and evidence-based practices of what's worked in that WKU library. So you can use that now, and as long as you can. I would recommend downloading as many articles as possible that you're interested in, because if you ever lose access to that data point, at least you'll have some sources. And if I haven't already, by the time you watch this video, I'm planning to take all of the articles that you all found and put them in a folder and give them to you, so you have evidence-based practices to take with you. So it's fantastic. And not only that, you also learned about baseline and intervention in single case design. And in group design, you learned about control groups and experimental groups. For your classrooms and in special education and general education, you'll most likely use single case more often. So you'll take 3 to 5 data points determining, okay, what's happening with the behavior or the academic performance now before I intervene, and see, okay, what is it really looking like? And then once you know it's stable, you can intervene, and you can find an intervention from one of the articles that you find on the WKU library or some other evidence-based practice that you find, put it in place, and then collect data for about 2 to 4 weeks. 2 is generally okay. If it's failing and the intervention just not working, then you can either tweak the intervention or move on. That's incredibly important because you as a general ed teacher or special ed teacher will need to collect data if you want to change challenging behaviors, if you want to improve academic performance. And also, you can use your grade book as a source of monitoring. If you grade consistently, you can also check people's grades and see who's falling behind each week. I, as a teacher, even do that. Even it's so amazing. Even if it's not special education, we even in a college class need it. I needed it when I was in college. And you hope that your teachers are monitoring things closely enough so that they see you're tanking, they'll reach out to you and say, hey, what's going on, and help you move in the right direction so there's not an end goal of failure. So that's important for your students too. And then finally, we looked at UDL and RTI. We found out, there's more than one way to teach besides paper and pencil. We can use audio, visual, you can use projects, presentations to score students. You can give them choice and highlight things and differentiate text. There's so much creativity to being a teacher, so I hope you can access all of that as much as possible. And then we also looked at RTI, which is that triangle that we looked at, and this is response to intervention. We want to make sure that our students aren't failing. We don't want to wait till the end of the year and say, oh, sorry, they failed. I didn't notice until May 5th, so now it's too late. We don't want to do that. We want to keep track of our grades and implement strategies at the appropriate level and the appropriate intensity as well. If you have questions about anything we've covered in the past, just let me know as always, and then we'll go over that. So this is an important place to start because today we're talking about disability categories. This chapter is about high incidence disabilities, and next week is about low incidence disabilities. Now, you all will be covering a lot of this in your group projects, so I'm only touching on it. I'm not going to give the in-depth because then it would be defeating the point of you also doing your projects. So before we get into the categories, we have to understand where this even came from. Remember, we talked about IDEA a couple weeks back. This is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, prior to this, and the other acts and laws that they put in place in those timeframes that were really dark for special education, now around the 1970s, I believe, somewhere in that time frame, we're seeing that students are provided a free and public education for students with disabilities. And this is ages 3 to 21, which is really fantastic. So IDEA is the governing, I don't know how else to put it, just the main focal point for special education. It really dictates the laws, how things are characterized, the definitions of disability, You'll see me stumble with my words sometimes when I get tired, so don't mind me. So IDEA is the main component. And some of the factors that they take care of besides just identification of students with disabilities is that they protect parent rights. Remember, advocacy was huge for parents. They're a lot of the reason why special education is even as it is today. And early childhood education gives them a lot of rights and help even before they start kindergarten. And then transition services are so important too. And that was my area of study, seeing how can we help students from the time they graduate high school and get them prepared in high school so that when they go to college or the workplace, that they're going to make it and be successful is the goal. So I'm going to skip past that slide actually. So what are the disability categories and where did they come from? So IDEA created these 13 disability categories. And sometimes it says 12, sometimes it says 13, just because of variations and very recently on what is a new disability. So with these categories, you can see there's a wide range, and all of the disabilities are encompassed under these 12 to 13. And these are the ones that you all are presenting on in your projects as well. This is divided into two parts. So first of all, it's high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities. High incidence disabilities are typically the ones where if you just walk into a classroom, you probably wouldn't be able to pinpoint who has a disability and who doesn't. They really just blend in with the classroom. You would really never know. And this is actually the population that I worked with at the alternative high school for those 5 or so years when I was teaching. So I could walk into a classroom and literally not know who had a disability besides the fact that I was a special ed teacher and I knew who they were. And honestly, I really tried to keep it that way. I didn't try and point them out, make a show of it, enter a co-taught classroom and say, oh, these are my kids right here. You know, we want to be respectful to our students, and we understand that a lot of students with disabilities feel a stigma. And I hate that that's the case, but it really is, and we want to be respectful around their peers. I actually, even on my email title, called myself a strategy specialist. So a lot of the students at the school really didn't even know what my role was. They thought I was just a teacher. They didn't know I was a special ed teacher, which was actually pretty nice because that limited the amount of stigma that my students had when I entered a room. So if your school allows that, that's great. If it doesn't, you know, we just want to be sensitive and respectful to our students, because our students with high incidence disabilities oftentimes every student does. And with high incidence disabilities, they really want to just blend in with everybody else and not be called out in that way. So this is important to note. There are 6 categories of high incidence disabilities. There are 2 on here that are not highlighted in red that should be. So please take note of this. Autism, high functioning autism specifically, should be highlighted in red. So imagine that. And other health impairment should also be in red. And then we have emotional disturbance, which is also called emotional behavior disorder, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, and then intellectual disability. And that's talking about mild to moderate, because there are 4 categories within intellectual disability. Note as well that special education, and actually education in general, love acronyms, and they love these little letters that they love to put together and confuse everybody. That's just kind of how it is. So high functioning autism can be seen as HFA. This is OHI, EBD, emotional behavior disorder, SLD, specific learning disability, SLI, and ID. So when I'm at a school and I'm talking to other special educators, I use the acronyms. So if you're a general ed teacher or going to be, and you're hearing these people say these terms, now you'll know. So just a reminder: OHI, EBD, SLD, SLI, ID, and HFA, high functioning autism. Yep, got that. So even I have to go back and think about these sometimes. So now we know IDA helps us define the categories. We know what the 13 categories are. We can now distinguish between which is a high incidence and a low incidence. And actually, let me just clarify. Everything in the black, excluding, like I said, autism and OHI, are considered low incidence disabilities. So deafblindness, deafness, hearing impairment, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, TBI, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, that's all low incidence. If you have more questions about this or need more clarification, feel free to take notes through these lectures, because I know I'm not live, and I know that makes things difficult, and I don't want to lose your questions. So if you ever do want more information or clarification, please email me or Zoom with me, because I want you to get the most out of this as possible. This is an interesting fact that I thought you all would enjoy. According to the research, and I'm citing all my references up at the top in case you want to go look up more information or use them in your project even, the number of students with an IEP has increased 74% from 1987 to 2012. That's a huge jump. And we have to keep in mind, all these categories and even special education services were not created long before this. But that's a huge jump from 1987 to the moment of 2012. And can you imagine 8 years later, right now? It's probably even more. So to me, this is just really shows that even general education teachers are going to have a large quantity of students with IEPs in their classroom. There's no way around it. And that's why this class is so helpful. And if you decide to either, continue if you're already doing a special education program or you want to pick one up, it will be very helpful for your career. Not only does it open up your job possibilities, but like it says here, it's rapidly increasing. And you will have students in your classrooms with disabilities pretty much at all times. So this is very good information to have. Thought this was interesting as well, that all the categories, the 13 that I had described, are all increasing except intellectual disability, which is decreasing by 13%. And then students in the OHI category, other health impairment, it's actually increasing by 1,600%. I personally, when I look at that, and I'll talk about OHI more in a minute, that includes the category of ADHD. So that could explain a lot of things with that statistic, that maybe, of course, the other disabilities, their health disabilities, and ADHD could be increasing at extremely rapid rates right now. So that's very important to know, that you'll encounter a lot of OHI in your classrooms. So why could this have happened? Why is this labeling and this categorization of students with an IEP increasing by 74%? Well, two reasons of why this may have happened. Remember that in 1990, autism and traumatic brain injury weren't even recognized until that point. So IDEA decided that, okay, this is a category. That obviously is going to increase the numbers quite a bit. And it's also important to remember that there was a whole different measuring system for screening. It was based largely on IQ. And if a student had a certain IQ, they were automatically considered eligible for a special education IEP. Now it's more related to RTI, like we talked about before. So it's less of a wait to fail model where you go through the whole year and all of a sudden, wow, my student has failed. It's May and I didn't realize it. RTI is supposed to help. Remember, it's that triangle. The base 80% are general education strategies that you would put in your classroom. And then that top 20%, I think it's 15 and then 5, I'll have to go back and look at specific numbers, but those are very strategic and high level interventions that are put in place for these students. If at the very top of that triangle that those strategies and interventions are not working, at that time, that's when they go into screening for special education. And they have to go through a lot of evaluations and tests. And sometimes doctors have to input on that. Teachers have to fill out surveys and forms for the students. The special ed teacher doesn't process all of that, but they do input into that, the happening of who's labeled with a disability and who is not. At that point, once all of the data is determined, they're either eligible for an IEP or they're not. And if they are, then they come to you as a special education teacher. You then get that student with their IEP. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any need for clarification on that, let me know. But that gives us an idea of why things are increasing rapidly. New categories are coming up. Screening, RTI is a big part of that. That's all changed. Well, here's the answer. I was going to ask you, but in your mind, and I'm going to back up to this. Oops. Remember that these top two should be red, so keep that in mind. Out of the two types, high incidence and low incidence, high incidence being red, low incidence being black, which one do you think is more prevalent? Before you saw the previous slide, because I stopped there too early, so you probably already saw the answer, but what would you have assumed before being in this lecture? Would you think that the categories in red would have been more prevalent and common in the classroom, or the categories in black? So think about that for a second as I move my slides over. The answer actually is that high incidence, the ones we're covering today, are more prevalent. They're at 62% of all students with disabilities have a high incidence disability. So that's obviously more than half. That's a big deal. When we think about, okay, so a large portion of students have a disability, 62% have a high incidence disability. So think about this. What would you have automatically assumed? Who is more likely to drop out of high school when it gets to that point? Students with disabilities or students without disabilities? So the answer is students with disabilities are more likely to drop out of high school. 20% of them drop out, whereas 10% of students without disabilities drop out. That's double the amount. And when you take that to millions of students in the United States, the number is a huge number of students who are dropping out right now. And it's unfortunate. And the reason why I say this, even though many of you are elementary education majors, your role as an elementary teacher is the most crucial thing, because as a high school teacher in an alternative setting where students were already failing in their normal schools and they were sent to our school and they were already having a tough time, I can tell you by talking to them that most of them had major issues starting in elementary school. A lot of them academically couldn't keep up in their classroom, and their teacher said, "Oh, sorry, you are doing terribly in this class, but I have 30 students in here, and I don't have time to focus on this one student," and they would just pass them through. So that student would just pass through all the way up until high school when they didn't understand basic math in third grade. So they couldn't understand it in fourth grade, then they couldn't understand it in fifth. And by the time they get to 11th grade, they're lost. And then behavior problems start surfacing. Or maybe they just become truant and they drop out because they think, I'm not doing well here at all. And they just leave. So your ability to catch students who are struggling early on is actually a preventative measure for them in the future. And also parent involvement is actually the number one strategy as well. Parents, they're usually highly active in elementary school, but when it comes to middle school and high school, parent involvement decreases. So that's also a huge factor. When you think about how this impacts them, if your students in elementary and middle just aren't getting the content, or they have a bad experience because a teacher told them they're stupid, that they can't do anything, and this actually happens, then that student hates school and they don't want to be there, and they're going to make it very evident. And that's your time to reconnect with the student and say, hey, I know you hate school. I told my students this all the time. I told them this the first day of school. Every time I started a new class at the beginning of the year, I'd say, especially where I was, where they were all at risk, but you might not have this completely, but you can take pieces of it if you want. I would tell them, I know you hate school. I know you don't want to be here. And I'm not going to demand your respect, but I'm going to ask that you do your best, that you respect your peers, that you respect me. And in return, I'm going to do everything I can to fight for you, to make sure you make it in this class, to help you when you need it, to listen to you, to respect you. And I have to prove it to you, I know, but this is what I'm planning to do. So I'm talking to a group of students who hate school, who are done with the idea of it, who failed all of their courses. They just are here as a holding tank until they turn 18. And that's the sad reality of where a lot of students get if intervention is not effective elementary and middle school. And I see the byproduct of it. And if they do drop out, then these are the results that we're seeing. They love talking about money. I started talking to my students about this statistic, and it kept several of them from dropping out, because if they do not get a high school diploma, on average, and remember, it could be higher or lower because this is an average, but $444 a week, compared to if they did graduate high school, they could potentially get close to $200 more a week. And they're like, ooh, I should do that. I should graduate. And then if they do a bachelor's degree, that nearly doubles. So we're talking money, because students who drop out or have these socioeconomic issues, they might live in poverty after this because they can't sustain unless they get some kind of apprenticeship job. And there's always special cases. I mean, my grandpa was from a long time ago, obviously, but in that day and age, he only got an 8th grade degree and he worked his way up. So I know there are cases where things aren't normal, but overall, this is what we're looking at: high poverty levels for students who drop out, and it just continues the cycle. So it's really our time to intervene as much as we can, as often as possible. And once they get to that point where maybe they didn't do well elementary to middle, these are the symptoms we start seeing in high school: suspension, poor academic performance, absences, truancy, inappropriate behaviors. They start skipping class. This is also very common for students who just have bad home lives, to be quite frank. If they don't have electricity or water at their house, or they don't have food and they're starving. I had so many students come to my classrooms like that, and I would get upset and look at the behavior and think, this student is angry, who's cussing me out, who just ran out of my room, whatever it might be. And I stop and later go back and say, hey, what's really going on? And I start implementing interventions and helping them. Some of them were telling me they have abusive home lives, they're hungry, it just goes on and on. So we're talking a lot about behavior today and in the future. It's like that picture of the iceberg. I wish I would have put that up here. You can only see the tip of the iceberg, but underneath there's a huge mound of ice, and that's how their behavior is. They're showing this behavior that's inappropriate, but there's so much going on behind the surface typically, and that's what we want to be aware of. So after that, I know that's a lot, but to me, that is the most important thing to remember: is you are sometimes that one chance a student has from going down a terrible path, that you might be the person who intervenes and they go down a better path. It feels like a lot of pressure, but it's just a reality, and all we can do is our very best every day with what we have. And learning these strategies will give you the tools to be your very best, behaviorally, academically, and I know you'll be great teachers. So let's move on to this. Students with EBD, emotional behavior disorder, are actually the most likely to drop out of all of the disability categories. So as you can see here, out of the high incidence categories, 50%, close to 50% are dropping out. So imagine you have a class of 10 students with emotional behavior disorder, 5 of them will not make it, and they're going to end up in a lifestyle that is probably not the best thing for them. That is just the statistics about it. So what are they more likely to do? Well, because of emotional behavior disorder just means they have characteristics. Let me go to the next one. This is what they're characterized by: inability to create or sustain positive peer relationships, continual mood or melancholy. They're not able to learn the academic materials for some reason. We really can't explain why. They might demonstrate inappropriate behavior at times that everything's normal. Nothing around them has changed, but they're either demonstrating externalized or internalized, which you should see in your textbook behaviors. And then also a fixation on personal problems, either from their home or their school, that turn into physical symptoms of fear, or their health starts going downhill. These are what they're characterized by, and because of that, they're more likely to be arrested, to drop out, to be expelled, to get suspended. That's 50% of EBD category dropout. The other high incidence categories are only a close to 25% dropout rate. So you can see that's quite a bit different. Keep in mind, I know this is specifically talking about EBD, but this is actually true for all disability categories. If you ever look at an IEP, it will say this characteristic or trait negatively impacts a student's academic or social performance. For them to be characterized with a diagnosis of a disability, that disability needs to impact them academically, like taking their grades downhill and they just can't sustain it, or a social interference, let's say they don't interact with peers, they're not able to communicate with peers, and that blocks their academic performance. So one of those two routes is what at the end of the day will categorize a student. This is the second disability out of the 6 that we're talking about. And I'm only going to touch on these briefly because, like I said, they're going to be in your group project. So I'm not going to try and steal your show here. So I'm going to keep it very simple. With learning disabilities, it is actually the most common disability out of all of them. As of 2006, 2.5 million students were diagnosed in the US with a learning disability. And typically they show above average intelligence, but there's usually 1 or 2 areas that they're not doing well. So for example, they could be doing so well in math, but reading class is so difficult. Maybe they have dyslexia, or the reverse can be true as well. So you'll typically see specific learning disability, which is they have one category, one topic that they're not doing well with. And that's a lot of times when you'll see students in a resource classroom. If they have reading issues, they might need to go to a specialized reading class and be in the general ed classroom the rest of the day. OHI is our third category that we're looking at with high incidence disabilities. OHI is other health impairment. That's the umbrella. ADHD is underneath OHI. It's a subcategory of OHI. So OHI just means that there are impairments due to chronic health problems. That could be asthma, diabetes, sickle cell, what are some other? There's a whole list in your textbook. ADHD is one of those, and it is the most prevalent of all OHI. You'll see, this is an example I just want you to notice when I was talking about the iceberg scenario. I had a student in my classroom who had ADHD, and he was so funny. He's one of my favorite students. Some days I would just get so perturbed from a teacher perspective. So he would be in my classroom, and he was actually a 9th grader. And he would be in his chair, just like I am now. And all of a sudden, while I'm teaching, he'll just pop up, stand up, and start dancing. And I'm thinking, what in the world is happening right now? Or he would start talking out, or he would interrupt me or interrupt a peer, and just tendencies that are not, teacher appropriate. You don't have those behaviors in a classroom and it go well for you. So a lot of students with ADHD are pegged as students who cause trouble, who are bad, all of these different things. If they're not managing this OHI category of ADHD, they can become a problem in the classroom. And sometimes a teacher will not recognize that this student has ADHD, and they'll just say, this student is bad. That's what a lot of teachers do. That they just see a behavior. This is affecting my class of 30 people, of 20 people, and then that's it. Instead of investigating. As a teacher, you are also an investigator now. And so your job is to figure out, okay, what's going on? And I'm going to give you the tools of what to investigate here in the next lecture. But once you figure that out, then it's your time to intervene. So I realized with that student that the mom called me later that day and said, oh, he usually takes ADHD medicine, and today he forgot it this morning. So you might see some behavioral changes. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, now it's all making sense. And there are other strategies. I mean, they have those fidgets or spinners or those what do they call those? Basically things that they can manipulate in their hand. I'm going to put it that way. Also, you could make a chart, and let's say the student has to sit for 10 minutes and there's a vibrating, like a buzzer kind of thing that vibrates every 10 minutes. As soon as it goes off, if they sat the whole time, they can stand up and stretch quietly while the class is still going on. So that would, it will help in those situations. You can look up more strategies on the WKU library to see what other researchers have done that has been effective. There's just so many ways to do it, but we just can't peg and say that student is bad because I see this behavior. It's our job to intervene and to facilitate success. High functioning autism. So this is a very important one as well. With this, you'll see that the students have a very high IQ, so smart, so intelligent, but there is some kind of a deficit in communication and social interaction. For example, I had a student who Absolutely. He was, from to this day, one of my favorite students I've ever had. I'll never forget him. He loved the Big Bang Theory. And just to set this picture a little bit more clearly, so this student came in and he would not talk to anybody. He had high functioning autism. He obviously had a communication and social interaction deficit. So I actually, what was it, his first year, and actually my first year of teaching as well, it was quite an experience. Within the first month of teaching, this student had a seizure, and I actually ended up going and visiting him. I went to visit him in the hospital. So while I was there, I don't know for what reason, he said, "You're the only one who understands." So he would talk to me, and he would talk to nobody else, no students, no teachers. And I had to really work with him to say, okay, here's some strategies. We had to have peer lunches and do all kinds of things to help bridge that gap, because he can't only talk to me, he needs to talk to them too. But when he did, he absolutely loved the Big Bang Theory. I mean, I'm sure some of you love it too, but he took it to the next level. Right here, it says that students with autism can misinterpret social cues, and they don't always know how to say something back that makes sense. So I might say, "Hi," and I'm going to make up a name. "Hi, Bill. How's your day today?" And he didn't know how to respond back to me. He would start saying a script, which is right here, a monologue or script from the Big Bang Theory. So he memorized, which is incredible, a scene from Big Bang Theory, and he used that as his response to me. And it was actually very close to the right topic. So it's so fascinating. And a lot of them with high functioning autism have very fixated interest and do not like changing routines. So this student's fixated interest was that he loved dates and travel. He could tell you like the road names without even looking on any road in Lexington, which is where we were, or what was the other thing he liked? Oh, he could tell you the day you were born if you gave him your birthday. So he asked me one day, and I just told him the day, the month, and the year of my birthday, as in, and he could tell me what weekday it fell on. So he said, "Oh, you're born on a Wednesday." I didn't actually even know that, and I looked it up, and he was exactly right. So incredible. They have so many talents and gifts, and we're there to just help facilitate just better communication and social interaction to bridge that deficit with them. Speech and language impairment is actually the second most prevalent disability that you'll find. It usually focuses on receptive and expressive language. It could be impairments in articulation, language, or voice. Fluency is another issue. So there could be a lot of stuttering, a lot of trouble with sounds in the words, and typically a speech language pathologist will come and work with these students. They might get pulled out of class once a week for 30 minutes, whatever their IEP says, and they call them an SLP. That's how I know them. That's what I've called them for so long. Sometimes I forget the actual words behind them. So it's a speech and language pathologist that they will come and work with. And then the last one here is intellectual disabilities. Typically in this situation, there are sub-average general intellectual functioning, and this results in adaptive behavior deficits. You might ask, what are adaptive behaviors? Well, in this case, it's communication and social skills, pretty much this whole list. They have trouble with independent living skills, budgeting, cleaning, shopping, interacting with others. They might have trouble eating or dressing themselves, brushing their hair, following directions. Maybe they have a hard time with academics, reading, telling time. And with this, not all students with intellectual disabilities are the same, of course, as with every student. The categories here are split into two sections. So high incidence would include mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. So if they have an IQ from 50 to 75, that's considered a mild intellectual disability. If they have an IQ from 35 to 55, that is a moderate intellectual disability. Severe to profound would be in the low incidence category because it's a more severe type of disability, whereas high incidence is less severe, though of course the impact is still there. But low incidence disabilities are typically the more severe side of disabilities, if that helps clarify it. So that's all we're going to talk about today. And I can't wait to see your projects. You can use your textbook, you can look up articles. Please make sure to remember to add strategies in there that you found on evidence-based practice for your disability category. Please watch the walkthrough video that I made if you have any further questions, or email me. I'm happy to answer. And I think that's it for today with high incidence, and we'll talk about FBAs in the next part of the lesson.